So today, of course, we're getting into the really early part of the Roman Empire. That's pretty much what I'm going to do today. And I think we're up to the point where we're talking about, we're still on Julius Caesar here, and talking about how the empire kind of comes in and the republic declines. So that's one of the things we'll get to today. I'll kind of talk about how you get Caesar and his nephew, really grandnephew Octavian, that comes in. That, of course, contributes to the collapse of the Roman Republic, which becomes really more of a dictatorship and monarchy. That's then called the Roman Empire, which, of course, will be later. So that's pretty much what we're going to talk about today, more or less. So that's a continuation of this PowerPoint lecture that I've got here. So I think we're up to talking about how they have what they call Caesar's Civil War. That breaks out usually from 49 to about 45 BC is the period of it. And what happens is, I don't know if I told you this or not yet. I don't think we got to it yet. I don't remember kind of getting to it, but the first triumvirate only lasted until about 53 BC. It lasted about 7 years, with Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar in it. Marcus Crassus, he actually ended up being killed in what is 53 BC. He went to the east, I think in what is around Turkey or so, Turkey, Syria, was fighting against the Parthian Empire. And the Parthians were this kind of Iranian state that formed in the east. And so he got killed. And so it left Caesar and Pompey at that point by themselves. And Pompey's backed by, the Roman Senate. And so he ends up, getting the support from them as sole ruler. And so Caesar decides that he's had enough of that. And so takes his, skilled armies that are in Gaul and eventually invades Italy in January 49 BC. And he marched his forces all the way to a river you may have heard of called the Rubicon, River Rubicon, which is like up in the northern part of Italy, which at that time was the northern border of Italy. And before he makes the crossing, he makes this famous quote that's well known. You may have heard of it. He says the statement, "The die is cast," realizing that, there's no going back once he crossed this river. And the term "die is cast" is now a saying meaning, no turning back. That's kind of what it means, more or less. And he realized that if he, if he, crossed this, river or whatever, at that point, he realized that he's really got two choices. Either he succeeds and is successful, or he's probably dead. Of course, the term die, if you know about that word, he's talking about dice, like he's rolling the dice. So he's saying he's gambling by crossing the river here. And so this is what sparks the whole Civil War, when he crosses over. Now, Pompey, he wasn't as good of a general as Caesar was. In fact, he didn't have enough, I think, of forces. And so he decided to flee Italy. He crossed over from the Adriatic Sea into what is Greece to try and get up reinforcements to fight Caesar's forces. And so Caesar marched into Italy. At that point, the Senate declares him dictator instead. At that point, and then Caesar starts racing around the whole republic. I think he goes all the way to Spain because of a revolt there. And then eventually marches even all the way to eventually Turkey and Syria, and eventually take all that. And he later takes over North Africa also as well. And then by 48 BC, Caesar eventually catches up with Pompey in what is Greece. And they fight a battle, I think it's in the western part of Greece, that's called the Battle of Pharsalus. And Pompey's forces actually had more forces. They actually outnumbered Caesar's forces, but Caesar just had better troops and crack forces. A lot of the Romans didn't want to fight on Pompey's side, and a lot of them quit. They refused to fight, and so Pompey's forces got totally routed in the battle. And most of Pompey's forces actually surrendered just to Caesar. They surrendered. They gave up. But Pompey himself fled basically the Republic, and he went to Egypt, where the Ptolemaic kingdom rules, of course, still at that time, to get refuge. And of course, what ends up happening when he goes down there, the king of Egypt, King Ptolemy XIII, who was probably the brother of Queen Cleopatra, or Cleopatra VII later, kills him, has him assassinated, Pompey. And I think when Caesar enters Egypt, he actually presents the head of Pompey to Caesar, which, Pompey is, again, I think I told you, the son-in-law of Julius Caesar. He was kind of unhappy about that. I think Caesar wanted to capture Pompey, and so he's pretty angry about that whole situation. Of course, when he's there, after he enters Egypt, one of the things that Caesar ends up doing, which is famous, Caesar eventually aligns with not Ptolemy XIII, but his sister, which of course is Cleopatra. And so they two form kind of an alliance against Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra, if you know about it, eventually becomes the lover and mistress of Julius Caesar. Would actually have a son with him. I think his name was Caesarion later. And or Ptolemy XIV, I think he called him also as well, I thought. And anyway, Caesar helps to basically put Cleopatra on the throne as the sole ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, which he will rule for over 20 years at one point. And I think at one point Cleopatra even came with Julius Caesar to Rome, like, and visited and all that. So, of course, one of the bad things about that civil war between, between Caesar, Cleopatra, and Ptolemy XIII is that there was an accidental fire, if you know about this, that burned down the library of Alexandria. I don't know if you know that, in the middle of the fighting, that for some reason happened, and I think it was an accident, and that was kind of a tragic thing that happened, you think, in history. From there, Caesar then just marched on. If you go to this map here, I can show you. You can see Caesar. Those are like the amount of conquest, like the extent of his conquest that Caesar did throughout most of the Civil War. And Caesar raced, basically, like I said, around the whole republic. And in a letter, eventually, that he wrote to the Senate, the Roman Senate, he remarked that it was so easy. The conquest. He said that Veni, Veni, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. And so with that, Caesar became one of the most famous, generals of course, the Roman period, and considered one of the greatest conquerors the Romans ever had. And this is going to be later part of the so-called Roman Empire that they'll have later. He's kind of pretty much conquering at that time. Caesar's then made, of course, I think he's pretty much made dictator by the Senate, like I told you about that. And at one point, he's made actually dictator for life. I think at first they made him like dictator for 10 years. And then eventually he was made dictator for life in 44 BC. And that was something that really frightened a lot of the Roman senators, because they got concerned that Caesar's getting too much power. Caesar was a reformer, though. He made a bunch of reforms to help like the lower classes. And then Caesar was known, if you know about it, he's the one that adopted the so-called Julian calendar, which was one of the first leap calendars that was supposedly created, which I think was influenced from the Egyptians originally. So, of course, the next thing that happened, if you know about it, with Caesar and all that, was that, of course, he got assassinated, of course, which happened in 44 BC. And what happened was a lot of the senators were fearful that Caesar was going to become this king like they had before, like a Romulus or whatever. They were worried that he was going to get rid of the traditional, things of the Roman Republic that had been there before. And so a group of senators started to conspire against him in 44 BC to try to eliminate him. And they became later known as, or at least they called themselves the liberators, because they felt like they were liberating Rome from this tyrant. And so eventually they conspired to assassinate Caesar on the date of March 15, 44 BC. Of course, that became known as the Ides of March, as they called it. The term Ides means the middle, like the middle of March, because I think most of the Roman calendar at the time, most of the months had 30 days in it. And so the 15th was the middle date. So the Ides of March. And the Romans had an old saying, if you know about it, which was beware the Ides of March, which you may have heard of. There was a bunch of conspirators that were involved, by the way, in Caesar's death. Some were his friends. A lot of these had been also supporters of Pompey as well. Those are the two most famous conspirators that were involved as part of the liberators. Gaius Cassius Longinus, you may have heard of him. He's one of them. And of course, the most famous is Marcus Brutus. And there's a debate about how Brutus is related to Caesar. Some people think he may have been like his son through like a mistress, but they've never really proven that before. So it's kind of a debate about that. But Brutus is supposedly related back to the Brutus family that supposedly originally started the whole Roman Republic a long time ago. Now, the assassination of Caesar, it didn't take place in the Senate or near the Senate. Like some people think that's where it was. It actually took place in an annex that was going into the Theater of Pompey. The Theater of Pompey was a theater that had been built by Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, remember the son-in-law of Caesar, which was used for entertainment, like doing plays, etc. And of course, what happened, the Senate would sometimes use it as a meeting place to have senatorial meetings. And supposedly on the day of the assassination, Caesar, the night before, had a nightmare or something like that about this whole thing. His wife tried to stop him from going to this meeting. And I think Mark Antony, we'll talk about later, tried to stop it too as well. And when he got to the annex, a bunch of the conspirators approached Caesar. And I think they approached him about some kind of petition that they wanted him to look at or sign. And when he tried to walk away, they grabbed him, basically, grabbed his toga. They wouldn't let go of him. And of course, what happened was they started stabbing him. And they think that Caesar was stabbed maybe 23 times or something like that. It's kind of a debate how many times it was. And supposedly Brutus was one of the first to act, one of the last to stab him. That's famous. And you may have heard or seen this Shakespeare play, of course, Julius Caesar. And of course, in that play, Shakespeare says that that Brutus said something like "et tu, Brute," and you, Brutus, is what it means. But they're not sure if that's was really said. That's, of course, Shakespeare, what Shakespeare said. But some of the other writers say that there may have been some things that Caesar may have said. Suetonius said that he may have said, Caesar, "You too, my son," or something like that. May have been the actual expression. Then some historians say he didn't say anything. And what you're going to say when you're getting stabbed, maybe screaming or whatever, but not have time to say, something like that as you're being stabbed. So I seriously doubt that. And Caesar's death caused a lot of chaos in the city, like just mob violence broke out. Fires broke out in parts of the city were actually burned down. Because of especially the lower class, like plebes or whatever, rioting, because Caesar was their man, that kind of thing. And the liberators themselves were all chased out of town, and it actually caused a civil war to break out, later called the Civil War of the Liberators, or something like that, or War of the Liberators, I think they called it. So it's precipitated, civil war, and then more civil war, they think, led to the old republic, pretty much ending. And so some people view the death of Caesar as being really when the Republic ends. That's kind of sometimes seen as the end date for it in 44 BC. But then later they sometimes put it at 27 BC when Caesar adopts the title Augustus from the Roman Senate. So it's kind of a debate about when it ends, but it's basically because of Caesar's death that the Republic kind of starts becoming more like an empire, or at least a dictatorship, and then it becomes an empire. Is what really happens. So that's the next thing I need to talk about next, what happens, of course. After Caesar's death, you have a nephew of Caesar that comes, actually his grandnephew is what it really is, which is Octavian, or they also call him Octavianus. He's called all kinds of names, or Octavius. It's got different names. Octavian's the more favorite name they usually use. But he's going to seize power, And he's going to do it through the help of these other generals that were under Caesar, which I'll get into, which of course were Mark Antony, or should be Marcus Antonius, but Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, of course, the two generals that helped Caesar, of course, seize power. So we're going to get into that and talk about that next, about what occurs with that. They have what they call the second triumvirate that comes in next, which you may have heard about. Yeah, Octavius or Octavian. It's usually either one. I think later it was changed to Octavian, though. And Octavius was only like 18 or 19 when Julius Caesar was killed. So that was his uncle or I guess great uncle. And he came to Rome to basically adopt his inheritance because Caesar had put Octavian in his will, gave him like a lot of money and land, even gave him his name. I think he became known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavius or something, or Octavianus, basically. And basically what happened was they formed this thing called it's called the Second Triumvirate, which was really a dictatorship of these three men, who I just put on the board there. But it was a dictatorship that they formed to basically, first of all, eliminate the liberators, which had taken over, control of the state or tried to, kill Caesar at that point. And so between 43 to about 42 BC, most of those men were hunted down, like Brutus, and I told you the other guy, which is Gaius Cassius Longinus, they were all hunted down and eventually killed as well. It was also a dictatorship, really, like another three-man dictatorship to basically control Rome, like it was before with the first triumvirate. But the first one was more secret to pact. This one was more well-known by everybody. And it didn't last long. It's kind of weird, but it lasted another 7 years, just like the other one did. In fact, it would last from, I think, 43 to about 36 BC. And over time, it would eventually, of course, break up. Of course, what would happen. And, of course, we'll get to it later. It's going to be mostly over a woman that caused it to break up, if you know about this. What happened was, first of all, the thing broke up because Marcus Lepidus, by the way, who was Marcus Lepidus and Mark Antony? They were both generals under Julius Caesar. Like Mark Antony was the main cavalry general that was under Caesar, and then Marcus Lepidus was like a general of like his legions. So they were kind of considered like his best generals. But Marcus Lepidus was pushed out. I think he later went into exile. Actually survived up to the early part of the Roman Empire. I don't think he was ever killed or anything like that. But it left two men left. And so Octavian and Antony formed this dual dictatorship to control the whole republic, which is becoming an empire. And so Octavian controlled the West, like mostly Spain, Gaul, Italy, and part of North Africa. And then Mark Antony controlled the eastern part from like where Yugoslavia, Greece, Syria, Turkey is, all that area. And I think part, and that's pretty much the bulk of what he controlled in the east. And Antony made an agreement with Octavian to marry Octavian's sister, who's of course named Octavia. And so the two are kind of form an alliance, not just politically, but through blood. Like their families kind of join, of course, with that. However, it's an uneasy alliance, of course, that forms, and mostly because when Mark Antony goes to the east, of course, he eventually falls in love with Cleopatra, which he's already met before, by the way. Before, I think when she had come to Italy, had met her, and they kind of knew each other, and so over time they became lovers. Eventually married over, of course, this other wife he has, Octavia, and they actually had 3 children together. I want to say 2 girls and a boy, I believe it was. I know they had 2 twins. If they had a set of twins, I know, and I think another girl. And This angered Octavian, not just because of the fact that his sister got, this other woman came in, took him, of course, obviously, but the other reason was they accused they accused Antony of trying to rule his eastern provinces from Egypt. So it seemed like Ptolemaic Egypt's trying to control what's going on with the Republic and all that. And so Octavian, the Senate, decided to declare war, on that should be wrong. That should be actually declare war on what is Antony and what is Cleopatra. So that's what happens in 32 BC. It's a typo there I need to fix. And so that war would drag on for about a year or two. It wasn't a very long war, about a year or two. I think they say it started back in 33. Some say 33 BC actually. But this war became one of the last major wars that will be fought at the end of the Republic. It's sometimes called different names. They'll call it Antony's Civil War, Octavian's Civil War. Some people call it that. Or also the last war of the Roman Republic, or also final war of the Republic. It's called all kinds of names. And Octavian easily attacks the east, going into Greece. Octavian was not really a general much, like militarily, like his uncle was Caesar. But Octavian had this general under him that was pretty good named Marcus Agrippa. You may have heard of his name. He's a very good general. He pretty much helped contribute to defeating pretty much Antony and Cleopatra's forces. And the most critical battle of the whole last war was the Battle of Actium, which was a naval battle off the coast of Greece, September of 31 BC. And basically, he was able to kind of neutralize their naval power, which would enable him to invade the east pretty much and take over Turkey, Syria, and then push into, of course, Egypt eventually. So eventually, Octavian conquers the eastern provinces pretty much. And Mark Antony, realizing that he might get captured by Octavian's forces, he didn't know what was going to happen to him or not, they're going to kill him or what they're going to do to him, he decided to kill himself. And so if you know about it, Mark Antony took out his sword and basically ran himself through and didn't quite die, though. He was actually brought to Cleopatra, where he actually died in her arms. And then later, Cleopatra was actually captured by Octavian, but she would live until 30 BC. And I think Octavian was going to take her to Rome, like in part of like a victory parade and all that. But she decided she didn't want to do that. And so supposedly she committed suicide. At least that's according to, I think, Plutarch. Plutarch, I think, was one of the writers that wrote about Antony and Cleopatra. And he claims that Cleopatra used some kind of poisonous snake called an asp to basically kill herself. So basically with, like I said, with Antony and Cleopatra dead, Octavian takes over the whole state, whole republic, which is, like I said, becoming an empire at that point. And what's going to happen is that basically Octavian's going to take this state and it's going to form into like what they think historians call, of course, later the so-called Roman Empire, which they say starts in 27 BC, although really it goes back before that, probably going back to Julius Caesar. It's already an empire at that point. And Octavian's going to eventually be known as Caesar Augustus, or also called Emperor Augustus. And he'll reign over 40 years. In fact, I'll get to it later. Augustus was the longest reigning emperor in Roman history, 41 years that he's in power. You can see that the Roman Empire, of course, will last up, from 27 BC, and it'll go all the way to what is to 476 CE. So there he is, Octavian, or later called Augustus, same person we're talking about, of course. And Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or Octavius, that's usually the name that he was originally called, or Octavian. And then later the Senate gave him this title, of course, which was, of course, Augustus. All right, let me go ahead and move on. Of course, I haven't yet reviewed yet, of course, about the Romans, which I'll do, of course, next today. And get into that. So here we go. Around what river was Rome found in the 8th century BC? Of course, I told you that was the Tiber River, of course. So we have that. What famous hill was the location where Romulus and Remus founded the city? They believe it was the Palatine Hill, which is the oldest of the one of the 7 hills, of course, where Rome, of course, was founded. What is the date usually I think of the founding of Rome? At least the Christian date, I guess, that goes back to BC times. That would be 753 BC. What famous historical work and its author chronicles Roman history from founding of Rome to the time of Caesar, Julius Caesar? That was, of course, the writer named Livy, also called Titus Livius. He wrote a series of books called the History of Rome, or, of course, the Latin name I gave you as well. What was the epic of the Aeneid about, written by the Roman poet Virgil, right? In the same time as probably pretty much Livy as well. The Aeneid was a Roman epic story that was a continuation of the Trojan War. It tells the story of Aeneas, who fled the sack of Troy, and he explored like the Mediterranean Sea, and he ended up in Italy, where he helped found what is later future Roman cities. Then what author wrote a series of biographies chronicling the lives of the nobles of the Romans? He also wrote about the Greeks, like Alexander the Great. That was the Greek writer Plutarch, who I've talked about numerous times. What was a famous Roman symbol that meant bundle? It usually meant bundle, or some people say bundle of rods. And it symbolized the imperium or power of like the rulers. That was the fasci. What year did Rome form its republic? They believe it formed around 509 BC. It was spurred on by the rape of a Roman woman named Lucretia, which I think was raped in 510 BC by one of the last king's son named Sextus. What does SPQR mean? That's what they call the Roman government, and sometimes the state, which stands for Senatus Populus Romanus, which means the Senate and the Roman people. What are the 2 main social classes of Rome? What assemblies did they use to address their political social ambitions? The 2 main social classes they had were the plebes or plebeians, which were the lower classes. Then you had the patricians, which were the nobility or aristocracy, upper class. They also had the equestrian or knights, or equites, which is kind of like an upper middle business class. Wouldn't worry about the slaves and all that and women. What were the main tasks of these various magistrates that ran the Roman government? The consul was the highest elected magistrate, which there were 2 of these. They replaced the monarchs. And they had veto power, and they could also create legislation and deal with like the court systems. The praetors were like these judicial officials that dealt with like Roman law and the court systems. The censor was a prestigious magistrate elected to 5-year terms. I think there's usually 2 of them. The censor was the one that built all the public works. He dealt with the Roman census. He dealt with censorship. And he also was the one that chose all the senators, or could also get rid of them if they're bad. Quaestor was the one that dealt with the Roman treasury and money. These are the money men, all of that. They also had the aedile, too. I told you about the aedile. Those are the ones that ran the public work. Not the public. Yeah, they did. They maintained the public works, like temples and stuff. They also put on the public games. What was the nickname for the historical period when the plebes got more political social rights in the 5th century BC? That was called the conflict of the orders. It's one of the names they called it. And that was a period where the plebes like went on strike and they got more political rights, like their own assembly. They even got their own political magistrates, which were called the so-called tribune, which you see is the next question. They also got the right to marry other classes, etc. What was the civic center of Rome? That was, of course, the Roman Forum I talked about. What were the Punic Wars? The Punic Wars were a series of wars fought between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire, or Carthage, fought between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The Carthaginian Empire was a trading empire that was found in North Africa by the Phoenicians around 900 BC. And it was based in Tunisia, mostly. It's where the capital it was, which is Carthage, where Tunis is. And It mostly controlled territory from Morocco to part of Libya. It also controlled part of Spain. It also controlled at one point Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The term Punic was used by the Romans from the word punicus or punici in Greek, which meant Phoenician, as in Phoenician wars, because they knew that it was, they knew it was, they were related back to it. Who were some of the famous historians that wrote on the Punic Wars? They were, I told you, they had Livy, who wrote the War with Hannibal, which was, I guess, the most famous one that was well known. The most famous one, though, was Polybius. Polybius wrote a series of books that were called the Histories of Polybius. They're the oldest and ones that go back further to like the 2nd century BC. Then Appian had one. He's not as important. He had one called the Roman History, but it's not as well known. Probably not as good as the other two. What caused the First Punic War to break out? It broke out over Sicily. Both wanted to control it, and the war was fought there, and also in a naval campaign I told you about. And Rome ended up taking over Sicily after the war. They also took over Corsica and what is Sardinia. Why is the Second Punic War the most famous of these three wars? It was famous due to Hannibal Barca. He was, of course, great Carthaginian general. He made the war bloody. And, of course, the Second Punic War was the bloodiest of the three Punic Wars, which may have resulted in 1 to 2 million people being killed. Hannibal was a Carthaginian general that was seen as the father of military strategy. He's the one that first started using tactics a lot in battle. And he was famous for his invasion of Italy, crossing the Alps. What caused the Second War to break out? The Second War, the Second Punic War, was caused by the conflicts over Spain. Both Carthage and Rome wanted control of it. And so when Hannibal attacked Saguntum, it started the war. What was famous about Hannibal's invasion of Italy? He took a huge army through the Alps, which included cavalry and elephants. And no, he'd never done that before. So I think he lost half his force, but something he's kind of known for, Hannibal. What battle did Hannibal wipe out at least half an entire part of a Roman army in 216 BC? That was the Battle of Cannae. Of course, we talked about. What famous strategy did Hannibal use in this battle? It was like an encirclement battle where his forces was able to encircle like an entire army. And some people also later call it a double envelopment, where you attack from the front and the rear and also sides. What was the famous quote that Romans used to say about Hannibal? They used to say, Hannibal's at the gates, which was often a term that they would say to like their children. They were being bad or would go to bed. What famous general eventually defeated Hannibal? That was Cornelius Scipio, or actually called Scipio. He was called Scipio Africanus. And he and the Senate came up with a different strategy to defeat Hannibal. And that was, of course, invading Africa and also Spain to force Hannibal out of Italy and maybe to fight him on equal ground somewhere. What battle did, of course, Scipio defeat Hannibal? That was the Battle of Zama, which was fought in Tunisia in 202. What are some interesting facts about what transpired in this battle in 202? Zama, of course, was a classical battle because you had two geniuses fighting, Hannibal versus Scipio. And of course, it was considered one of the last major battles where elephants were fought, at least in the West. So they were made obsolete after battle. Hannibal was beaten. Of course, the Romans took over Spain. What occurred after the Third Punic War? The Third Punic War, of course, which happened in the mid-2nd century, resulted in Carthage being destroyed. It was wiped out by the Romans. What Roman senator backed the war the most? That was Cato the Elder. He was a Roman senator, great orator. He became famous for his quote, "Carthage must be destroyed," or, of course, the famous quote, "Carthago delenda est," which is the Latin. What was the outcome of the siege of Carthage, which happened in 149 to 146? Under Scipio Aemilianus, Carthage was sacked and burned and destroyed, like in about a week. It was just totally destroyed. And of course, there's a legend that it was plowed under and they poured salt everywhere, but they think that's false. What are the main causes why the Roman Club became an empire? At least two major causes. One was the rise of these political dictators that seized control of the republic, like Marius and Sulla and Caesar, etc. And that led to the empire. And of course, the different rival, dictators caused civil wars to break out, which they think also killed the republic as well. Were some changes made to the Roman honor under the Marian reforms? What was the famous general Gaius Marius known for? It's kind of those are kind of together, those questions. Gaius Marius was considered like one of the first dictators that came to power. They think he helped cause the decline of the republic. And a lot of it had to do with the Marian reforms. These were reforms where they professionalized the Roman army, which gave it a lot of power. And under it, he allowed any Roman male citizen to join. And so a lot of the people that went into it were lower classes. And a lot of them were just fighting for the general and not really for the state. He also created the cohort legion, which were legions where a cohort of 480 men made up the bulk fighting unit of a legion. So you have 10 cohorts in a legion, which is 4,800 men. And I told you from there, they break it down to like 80 men in a century. Whom did Gaius Marius eventually fight in the civil war of Rome? They call it, of course, Cornelius Sulla, who eventually seized power. They fight what it's called Sulla's Civil War. And eventually Marius is exiled, dies, and then, of course, Marius takes over. Sulla takes over the republic at that point, and Sulla becomes like a dictator for like 3 or 4 years. So Sulla is one of the guys that helps really revive the dictatorship officially, and it becomes something you see later. What was a triumvirate? Triumvirate was a deal where they had a 3-man dictatorship, were packed between 3 powerful politicians that controlled Rome. And there were 2 of them. They had the first triumvirate, and then they had the second triumvirate. The first triumvirate, of course, was a political alliance to control Rome between Gnaeus Pompey, Marcus Crassus, and Julius Caesar. So those 3 men would take over the state, and over time they helped to kind of erode it away and become, later an empire. And also the Spartacus revolt. Forgot about that. Spartacus revolt was a slave revolt that broke out in Italy at the end of the Republic between 73 to 71 BC. And it was led by this ex-gladiator and Thracian soldier named Spartacus, I've heard of. And Pompey and Crassus were involved in putting it down as generals, and that's what made them famous later. What campaigns in France made Julius Caesar popular? Those are the Gallic Wars, which were fought in the 50s BC. That was a series of conquests where he conquered the Gallic peoples in what is France, which the Romans called Gaul, and it made him a household name. And so Caesar starts to become a really good general later. Caesar also wrote historical works. I talked about one of them. One was called the Commentaries on the Gallic Wars that he wrote, which were about the campaigns in Gaul. He has another work you may have heard of. I don't know if you heard of it, but it's called the Civil War, which is later about the part of the war with him and Pompey fighting. But they don't think he actually wrote it. They think it was ghost written by somebody. So I don't know if that's really written by him, but it's attributed to him, but they're not sure if he really wrote it. So all this rest of stuff I've already covered. I don't know if I'm going to do all this real quick here because I need to probably move on because I just covered that just a few minutes ago. So all this rest of the review here we've done today already. So I need to go ahead and move on to talk about, of course, the Roman Empire today and get into that because that's something we need to really talk about today because I want to talk about this today and next week, getting into the Roman Empire. I might have maybe I get 15, 20 minutes in if I can, possibly. But so after, like I said, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were killed, you've got, of course, like I said, the Roman Empire forms. But the Roman Empire, of course, lasts, you can see there, from 27 BC to what is 476 CE, which is like around 500 years. That doesn't include the Byzantine Empire, which of course follows later, which continues, into East up to like 1453 CE. Of course, later. We're starting to get into, of course, in that CE AD range, which AD means Anno Domini, it's the old Christian name. And CE means a common era, usually, not Christian era, usually. And let's talk about Augustus. Augustus was really important figure. He, of course, if you know about it, was seen as the father, of the Roman Empire. He's kind of like the George Washington, if you want to call it that, of the Roman Empire. So he's their first emperor that will come in. And of course, the period of Augustus is later, I'll get to it later, it's later called the Age of Augustus. It's kind of a nickname that they call it. And Augustus over time is given different titles. Initially, the first title they give him in 27 BC is Augustus, which has got all kinds of translations of what the name Augustus means. One translation, I got two up there I've got, is a venerable or illustrious one, I guess would be kind of what it would mean. It's basically saying that he's a great man, is what really, I guess the translation. So they're talking about his greatness, more or less, about especially with age, as he got older, as a wise man or whatever, that kind of deal. But he hated the title. He couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand being called Augustus. Probably wanted to be called Octavian, is his real name. But they, of course, gave this other title later as well, you see there, which originally is called Princeps Civitatis, but it's been, over time, they shortened it to Princeps, which is supposed to mean like first citizen or first citizen of Rome, more or less. And so he preferred that title, to rule by, because it was seen as being less regal. It sounded too much like a monarch, and all that. And so he still wanted to believe that there was this republic that still existed, even though it's becoming more like a autocratic type empire ruled by these monarchs now, emperors. He used that term. And of course, all the emperors officially later are called princeps. That's the actual title they use up to like the 3rd century CE. In fact, they call it the period of the Principate, is what they usually dub the early part of the Roman Empire. But the people, the Roman people themselves, of course, call the Roman emperors, they call them Caesar. That's what they call, of course, going back to the name of Julius Caesar and their family, et cetera. So they use that term. So like you read the Bible, like in the New Testament, where they use that term Caesar a lot, and it's kind of confusing which one we're talking about, So depends on when it is. So they might be one emperor, but it might be another, more or less. There's a lot of historians I want to talk about too while I'm sitting here talking about. I think I've got a slide on that too I can share with you. But there's at the time of Augustus, there's a lot of different emperors that wrote about Augustus. Those are the three that are usually considered the big ones. Cornelius Tacitus, you may have heard of Tacitus. He's pretty big. He lived between the 1st and 2nd centuries. He's considered to be the greatest Roman historian, like of all time. He would be like the Suetonius, or not the Herodotus, Thucydides kind of writer, I guess, going back to that time, more or less. And I think I've got like all the different works they wrote. If you want to know, where is it? Well, I've got that right here. But yeah, here's the ones that they wrote. Tacitus wrote a bunch of books, Annals of Rome, and he also wrote the Histories of Rome. Both those, like I think the Annals of Rome is about the early. I know the Annals is about the early empire. I know that, like under Tiberius up through like Nero's reign and all that. And then the Histories of Rome is about the late 1st century. I think it goes up like the Flavian dynasty, which I'll get into later. Then he's got another book called The Life of Agricola. I don't know if you heard of Agricola, but Agricola was a Roman general later, and he was the father-in-law of Tacitus, and he wrote a history of like a biography of his life. And Agricola was like a general and I think a governor of like Britain and all that. And Agricola was the one that helped conquer Britain later. Cassius Dio is another one, of course, I've got there on the bottom. I'll get to him in a second. But also Suetonius, the 12th Caesars. He was another one. I think Suetonius was like a senator at one point. He was also a librarian. And he under what is like the period of the five good emperors, which would be like you see Pliny and Trajan and Hadrian, those guys. He basically wrote a series of biographies about the first Roman emperors, like the first 11. And he also has a biography on Julius Caesar. So he starts with Julius Caesar and he goes up through the Flavian dynasty and all that. His is pretty good too. I think Suetonius is pretty complete work. Cassius Dio had a series of books too. Like it was an entire work on Rome, just like Livy had, called the Roman History, or Historia Romana, I think it was called as well in Latin. And that one's pretty good too as well overall. So those are all some of the writers that write about the emperors, and that's where we get all our information from. And Cassius, sometimes called Cassius Dio. It's kind of reversed. I don't know why, but they reverse it for some reason, the name. All right, now let me get more into Augustus and talk about his reign, more or less, some of the things that he did. Now, the period when he reigned was, I told you, about around 40-41 years that he was in power. It's often called the Age of Augustus. It's kind of a nickname they called it. And it was considered a golden age, not just because of the fact that the Roman Empire began to flourish as a power, but also the fact that it was also like a peak period of like Roman growth, like in the cities. Also, Roman, like a lot of the literature, art, poetry, history really peaked kind of around that time as well. And after, and it's also, I get to it later, the beginning of the Pax Romana, of course, that comes in. And I told you that Augustus was the father of the Roman Empire, and also the fact that he was the longest reigning emperor, and nobody comes closer after that. I think the other emperors that come later, it's only like 20-something years, actually. So the one thing that he's famous for, Augustus, Emperor Augustus, is that he's the one who started the Pax Romana, which everybody's heard of, which is called the period of so-called Roman peace, which is what it means. And this is a period like around 200 years where the Roman Empire peaked as a state, like in Europe, North Africa, and part of Southwest Asia. And in that time period, the empire, I think, peaked in size like 2 million square miles overall. And you can see it started, they think, when I guess he became emperor, if you want to put it at 27 BC, and it goes up to about 180 CE when Marcus Aurelius dies. So that's usually the time period of it. And by the way, it was considered to be one of the most peaceful periods in world history. There are very few wars that were fought outside and inside the Roman Empire, because after the Pax Romana ended, it's been nothing but wars, if you know about it. It's also the period where the rise of Christianity starts. We'll get to that. I don't know if we'll get to Christianity today. Probably not. I'll probably talk about the next lecture next week. But that's another thing that happens too, is the rise of Christianity starts first, second centuries, pretty much during the Pax Romana. And Augustus, like I said, I kind of like he's the father of Rome. You know, he rebuilt a lot of the city of Rome. There was an old saying about Rome, I think, when Octavian or Augustus got there. He got there in when he started with it, it was brick, and when he left, it was marble. That was the old saying about Rome. He rebuilt like a lot of roads throughout the empire, aqueducts to feed water to the cities, things like that. And on the bottom there, you know, you know about Augustus. Augustus was the one that created the so-called Praetorian Guard, which were the imperial bodyguards of the emperors, which was like the size of a Roman legion, like something like 4,000 or 5,000 men. And they were very instrumental in not just protecting the emperor and his family, but also a lot of times they had a lot of power in deciding who the next emperor would be, because the military was often who decided who the next emperor would be, not the Roman Senate. So it wasn't necessarily based on like lineage or hereditary means. It'd often go to the guy that was the most powerful and the guy that the military thought should be in power. So that's something different, you know, compared to like the Republic, the way it was, you know, before. Of course, you'll see that video later, but one of course, Augustus' big failures as emperor is to take over Germany, Germania, as of course the Romans called it, which of course the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was an example of that, which was a total disaster. The so-called, that's a typo there, just see it. It's called the so-called Varian, it should be Varian disaster. They dubbed it, named after the guy that was the commander of it. Anyway, they never did take over Germany, starting this time. And I think there's later a story where he was so mad about it that he started beating his head against the wall and kept saying, "Give me back my legions." He kept saying, or something like that. He was pretty angry about it. Now, Augustus also, one other thing he did too, it's famous, he started a new dynasty that's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which includes basically those 5 emperors that are basically in it. You got Augustus, the founder. You got Tiberius, he was his son-in-law. Tiberius was a general under Augustus. In fact, was kind of like an adopted brother of Germanicus. They talked about that video. They knew each other. And then Caligula, of course, a nephew of Tiberius. Caligula was actually the son of Germanicus, who would become emperor. And then 4 was Claudius, or Claudius the First, they called him, who was Caligula's uncle. And then Nero was Claudius's grandnephew. That's how they're all related and all that. I think the only one that wasn't related back to the Julian family and all that was Claudius. He kind of married into the family. And so that's why they call it Julio-Claudian dynasty, more or less. And they reigned from like 27 BC to like 68 CE. So they reigned about a little over 100 years that they're in power. And they're the only actual, they're the only ones related back to Julius Caesar and Octavian, because all the later emperors that come in, like in dynasties, are not related to them. So it's the first imperial dynasty of the Roman Empire that you got. And but basically after Augustus, pretty much all the emperors are called Caesars. That's what they start calling them and all that. Even though Princeps for a long time was the actual title that they actually went by. Let me talk about some real quick here. I guess I got time maybe for some of them, but I'll get maybe a couple in them. But Tiberius reigned next. He came in and reigned after Augustus died of natural causes. And by the way, Tiberius was the second longest reigning emperor in their history. And he came in kind of like, was not really that popular. In fact, he ends up being this tyrannical ruler that the Romans didn't really care for. But he was in power like 20 something years, 23 years. Was how long he was in power. And he was a former general, of course, under Augustus, like one of his generals that was important. And he went on to marry one of Augustus's daughters. So he was like basically a general and son-in-law of Augustus. And Augustus adopted him as his son. And so he became like his son, basically, and took over afterwards. However, the only problem was that Tiberius was very tyrannical, like I said. He was known for a lot of political repression, which a lot of the Julio-Claudian rulers were kind of known for. Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, as you may have heard of. They all basically saw these enemies of the state that were out there that were kind of against him. And he was kind of fearful that he would get assassinated, like Julius Caesar was. And so he arrested a lot of people he thought was a threat to his regime. He put them on trial, like these so-called treason trials, which were run by the Praetorian Guard. And they had a lot of people executed, which may have been the reason why Jesus of Nazareth was killed. It could have been, because that happened under Tiberius. When Jesus was crucified in Israel. And at one point, Rome was actually controlled by the Praetorian Guard under him. This guy named Macro, he was the head of it. And he, for a bunch of years, controlled everything. And I think at one point, Tiberius ended up living on an island off the coast of what is Naples, called the Isle of Capri. It's called. So they can around here, it's a casino, Louisiana. And but anyway, we lived there like in a palace And I think Caligula lived with him for a while. I'll get to Caligula in a little bit, but he lived with his uncle. And anyway, total debauchery too, because they think Tiberius was kind of, I think he was kind of like bisexual. Like he liked boys a lot. I don't know if you know the story about that. And anyway, what happened was Tiberius was eventually either died of natural causes, or there's another theory that Caligula killed him, like had him smothered to death so he could take over or something like that. So there's been kind of a debate about that. And so Tiberius died 37, and the Romans were so happy about Tiberius dying that they kept chanting Tiberius to the Tiber, Tiberius to the Tiber, because sometimes what the Romans were known for doing, if they killed somebody they didn't like, they just throw the body in the Tiber River. So they hated Tiberius a lot. And what would happen is Caligula would take over, and Caligula, was just this tyrannical ruler. They thought he was going to be a great ruler who came in. He was actually the great grandson of Augustus that would come in, and he would turn out to be just as bad as Tiberius was. He's later called Little Boots, and you probably heard of him. And I'll get into him later. Looks like I guess I'm running out of time. I don't want to make my lectures too long, but in the next lecture, I'm going to, of course, continue talking about the first century of the Roman Empire, and then I'm going to get into talking about the rise of Christianity. I'll talk about the Flavian dynasty, and I should have time to maybe get into and start talking about the period of the 5 good emperors in the 2nd century. So it's probably going to take me a couple more lectures, hopefully, to finish most of the Roman Empire, more or less, hopefully next week. But I didn't want to get too long today because y'all have, of course, a Canvas quiz on this section coming up on the early history of the Roman Republic and early history of Rome. So that's it for today. Remind you, don't forget that I do have 2 new assignments up. The one I told you on, of course, on the early Roman history up to this part of this lecture here today. And then, of course, you've got also that new video assignment to do on that Battle of Teutoburg Forest. I showed you a little video clip on. And then, of course, don't forget your second exam is still up. So that's still up today. And I'll probably leave it up till Friday. I think I'll just leave it open 2 more days and all that. And that's it. So that's it for today. Let me know later if you have any questions, of course, about this lecture, and send me some comments, questions, etc. And I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. And that's it. So y'all take care, and I'll see you later.